It began, as many Southern scandals did, with whispers. In the autumn of 1846, Savannah was a city where gossip traveled faster than the tide rolling up the river. Behind lace curtains and polished silver tea sets, the city's elite murmured about a pair of women who had finally gone too far. The Preston twins, Elizabeth and Margaret, were names everyone knew but few dared to speak aloud with warmth. 4 years, they'd been an oddity. 2 unmarried women, wealthy beyond measure, running Willow Creek Plantation with an independence that made the men of Chatham County uneasy. They didn't host parties. They didn't attend church regularly. And worst of all, they seemed to need no one's approval. Then, on one strange autumn evening, something happened that shattered Savannah's fragile social order. At a small gathering of local landowners and families, the Preston sisters appeared unexpectedly. They stood side by side, pale, stern, their hair tightly coiled, their dresses plain but immaculate. Yet what caught everyone's attention wasn't their appearance. It was their announcement. Calmly, almost proudly, Elizabeth introduced 2 well-dressed men standing just behind them. "Allow me to present," she said, "our husbands." A hush fell over the room, the kind that feels heavy, suffocating. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then someone gasped. Because the men, dignified, handsome, and dressed like gentlemen, were known to some of those gathered. They weren't visitors from Charleston or Atlanta. They were former slaves of Willow Creek. In that instant, every polite mask cracked. The whispers began before the evening was even over. Some called it lunacy, others blasphemy. But the truth, whatever it was, had already slipped from behind those parlor walls and into the bloodstream of Savannah itself. Within days, the story reached every corner of the county. At barbershops, on street corners, even in church pews, people spoke the same words again and again: the Preston sisters married their slaves. For the women of Savannah society, it was unthinkable. For the men, it was an insult. And for those who lived in bondage across Georgia's plantations, it was something else entirely, a story whispered with equal parts disbelief and secret, dangerous hope. Who were these women who dared to challenge everything their world held sacred? Were they mad, or simply free in a way few ever dared to be? Dr. Samuel Wilson, the family physician, was among the first to witness the aftermath. Summoned to Willow Creek one evening under urgent circumstances, he found the sisters perfectly calm, and the 2 men dressed in tailored coats, seated beside them like equals. When he refused to record the marriages in the family Bible, Elizabeth simply smiled and said, "Then the truth will wait until someone braver writes it down." By the following week, Savannah was in full moral panic. Newspapers avoided the subject, but sermons hinted darkly at unnatural unions. Neighbors kept their distance, merchants gossiped in low voices, and even the enslaved community felt the tremor of something unprecedented. Because in 1846, Georgia was a place where a white woman's virtue was treated like property, and the idea of a white woman choosing love outside her race wasn't just scandalous. It was treason against the very order of things. But for Elizabeth and Margaret Preston, something had already shifted, something irreversible. And as the magnolia blossoms faded and autumn settled over the red clay fields, the sisters withdrew behind the high iron gates of Willow Creek, taking their secret, their defiance, and their husbands with them. The whispers, however, did not fade. They only grew louder, until the entire South could hear them. To understand the scandal, you have to understand the women behind it. Willow Creek Plantation stood some 17 miles west of Savannah, 2,000 acres of rich Georgia soil, bordered by pines that whispered like ghosts when the wind swept through. For decades, it had been one of the region's proudest estates. But by the 1840s, it had become something of a mystery, and its mistresses, Elizabeth and Margaret Preston, even more so. The twins were born in 1812, daughters of Thomas and Caroline Preston, a family whose wealth was as vast as their reputation for cold perfection. When their parents were killed in a carriage accident in 1839, the sisters inherited everything: the land, the slaves, the house, and the crushing expectations that came with all 3. They were only 27 then, young, unmarried, and suddenly powerful. But instead of remarrying or appointing a male relative to manage the property, they did something almost unthinkable for women of their time. They took control. And Savannah never forgave them for it. Neighbors whispered that the sisters were unwomanly, too assertive, too private. They rarely attended social events, and when they did, They were remembered less for their manners than for their faces, heavy-set, sharp-featured, prematurely aged. In a society obsessed with beauty and marriage, their appearance made them easy targets. People called them the ugly twins, often within earshot, as if cruelty were a form of entertainment. But behind those whispers was something else: fear. Because Elizabeth and Margaret Preston represented a kind of independence that threatened everything the Old South believed in. Two women, alone, running a vast estate with efficiency and intellect that outperformed many men. They managed crops, balanced ledgers, and directed over 70 enslaved workers. They made decisions with confidence, signed contracts, and kept their accounts pristine. Yet beneath that image of quiet authority, something deeper was happening, something that Savannah society would never comprehend. Those who worked at Willow Creek later recalled that the twins treated the enslaved differently than most plantation owners. They were strict, yes, but also peculiar. There were rumors that certain men were taught to read, that the house servants were unusually well-spoken, that the sisters allowed small freedoms rarely seen elsewhere. And two names surfaced more than any others: James and William. No one knew exactly when the relationship between the Preston sisters and these two men began to shift, from master and servant, to something more complicated. Some said it started with trust, others with curiosity. But one thing was certain: as the years passed, the four of them began to build something quietly subversive, a hidden world within the walls of Willow Creek. Inside that grand, decaying house, the hierarchy of the South blurred. Conversations stretched late into the night. Accounts were managed together. Books, forbidden books, were read aloud by candlelight. The twins' isolation from Savannah society only deepened their bond with the men they came to rely on. Was it love? Compassion? Rebellion? Perhaps all three. To outsiders, the Preston sisters were strange, pitiful, and perhaps even grotesque. But inside their world, they were sovereigns of their own design. Two women who refused to be pitied, refused to be controlled, and refused to live by the rules of men who mocked them. And when they finally made their scandalous announcement, it wasn't a sudden act of madness. It was the culmination of years of quiet defiance. They had built their own order, one that existed only as long as no one looked too closely. But in the South of 1846, secrets had a way of rotting under the heat. And soon, the world outside Willow Creek would come knocking. It's hard to say exactly when rumor became reality, when whispers of impropriety hardened into something undeniable. But by the autumn of 1846, there was no longer any doubt: the Preston twins had done the unthinkable. They had married their former slaves. At least, that's how Savannah told it. The truth, the messy, human truth, was far more complex. James and William were not ordinary laborers. They had been educated in secret, a dangerous act punishable by law. The twins' late father, Thomas Preston, had recognized something rare in the two young men: intelligence, grace, and a quiet determination that set them apart. He had trained them for house service, teaching them to read and manage accounts. After his death, Elizabeth and Margaret continued that education in defiance of every rule of the South. Within 7 years, those lessons evolved into partnership. James and William became more than attendants. They became the sisters' confidants, collaborators, and, eventually, their equals. In the eyes of the world, this was madness. In the eyes of the sisters, it was truth. Those who later visited Willow Creek described an unsettling transformation. The plantation still ran smoothly, cotton picked, ledgers balanced, wages paid. But something in the atmosphere had changed. Deliveries increased. Orders for fine men's clothing and grooming supplies appeared. A Savannah jeweler quietly noted a strange commission: 2 gold wedding bands, men's sizes, paid for on Preston credit. Inside that house, far from the judgmental stares of society, something sacred, or sinful, depending on who you asked, took root. At night, behind closed shutters, the four dined together. They read aloud from books considered dangerous: philosophy, theology, poetry. They debated the nature of freedom, of love, of God himself. The enslaved staff noticed that Elizabeth began referring to James as Mr. James, and Margaret to William as my companion. Small titles, perhaps, but in the world of 1846 Georgia, those words were revolution. And then came the moment that would ignite the scandal. At a gathering in Savannah, the twins appeared side by side, as always. Yet this time, they were not alone. Dressed in tailored coats, James and William stood behind them, dignified, silent, steady. Elizabeth's voice didn't tremble when she said it. "Allow me to introduce our husbands." The room froze. No one spoke. It was as if the world itself had tilted off its axis. Some believed it was a joke, others thought the sisters deranged. But the truth was written on their faces, calm, unwavering, utterly certain. That single declaration tore through Savannah like wildfire. Within days, preachers denounced it from their pulpits. Plantation owners discussed it in horror. Even newspapers, careful to avoid direct mention, hinted at a matter of great moral decay among the county's elite. But what shocked them most wasn't the act, it was the audacity. The sisters hadn't hidden it. They had made their love public. They had called it marriage. In a society built on the ownership of human beings, they had stood before God and the world and claimed equality. To the powerful men of Georgia, it was a desecration, an unforgivable crime. But to those who could see beyond the color line, it was something else entirely. A kind of courage. And while Savannah society reeled in outrage, behind the tall gates of Willow Creek, the Preston twins finally lived, if only for a brief and fleeting season, as they believed they were meant to. It would not last. Because in Georgia, love like that came with a price. The scandal might have ended as rumor, a dark little tale whispered at tea tables, if not for the journals. When Dr. Samuel Wilson, the Preston family's longtime physician, was summoned to Willow Creek in late September of 1846, he expected illness. What he found instead would haunt him for the rest of his life. He arrived at twilight, the kind of southern dusk where the air feels heavy and still, and even the trees seem to listen. The message he'd received had been urgent but vague. "Miss Elizabeth and Miss Margaret request your immediate presence," it said. As his carriage rolled up the long drive, he noticed something strange. The fields were quiet, too quiet. The usual rhythm of plantation life, the calls, the clatter of labor, seemed suspended in the air. And at the steps of the grand house stood two men in tailored coats, neither bowing nor stepping aside. They simply looked at him, calmly, confidently, and ushered him in. Inside, the parlor glowed with candlelight. There sat Elizabeth and Margaret, perfectly composed, their faces pale but serene. Seated beside them, those same two men, dressed as gentlemen. "Dr. Wilson," Elizabeth greeted, "we thank you for coming. There is a matter we wish you to record officially." He sat across from them, confused, waiting for an explanation. Then she handed him the family Bible, opened to the page where generations of Preston marriages had been recorded, and said, "You may write down our unions." He blinked. "Your what?" "Our marriages," Margaret said softly, her hand resting over William's. "Last Sunday, here at Willow Creek." The doctor later wrote in his journal that he felt an immediate and profound disorientation, as if I had stepped into a fevered dream. He tried to reason with them, to suggest that their condition might be emotional, not moral. But Elizabeth only smiled, saying, "We are in perfect health, doctor. What disturbs you is not our madness, but your own reflection." That night, he left without making any entry in the Bible. His hands, he noted, trembled as he signed his carriage bill. Within days, Dr. Wilson's account reached Reverend Thomas Blackwell of St. John's Church, who also visited Willow Creek. His letter to the bishop still survives. The sisters appear lucid, intelligent, yet utterly depraved in conviction. They speak of equality between white and black, mistress and servant, woman and man, as though such heresies were ordained by heaven itself. Blackwell refused their donation to the church. "I will not sanctify delusion," he wrote, though privately he admitted to colleagues that their composure unnerved me more than any sign of frenzy might have done. And so, as autumn deepened, the narrative began to shift. What society could not comprehend, it chose to pathologize. Newspapers described the Preston sisters not as sinners, but as lunatics. The Savannah Chronicle hinted at a most grievous affliction of female hysteria. Dr. Wilson's notes were cited as medical evidence, a dangerous contagion of the moral faculties. In truth, there was no madness, only defiance. But in 1846 Georgia, defiance was the truest form of insanity. Behind the iron gates of Willow Creek, the four lived quietly, their lives now the subject of rumor, ridicule, and moral outrage. And yet, within those walls, something rare persisted: calm, routine, perhaps even joy. Outside, the world branded them insane. Inside, they called it love. But the walls of Willow Creek could not protect them forever. Soon, those who claimed to save them would come, bringing with them the law, the church, and a verdict that would seal their fate. By January of 1847, the whispers had turned into formal concern. Letters passed quietly through the hands of Savannah's most respected families: cousins, lawyers, ministers. Everyone had heard the same story, and everyone claimed to know someone who could fix it. Eventually, one of those letters reached the desk of Charles Montgomery, sheriff of Chatham County. It came from a distant relative of the Preston family, a man in Charleston who'd had enough of the rumors. He urged an official welfare check, concerned, as he put it, for the well-being of my cousins and the integrity of our family name. Sheriff Montgomery was no fool. He'd heard the gossip like everyone else, but this was now a matter of record. And so, on a gray morning in early January, he rode west toward Willow Creek. The plantation came into view slowly, the white columns of the house rising out of a sea of dormant cotton fields. The place looked orderly, quiet, almost peaceful. If madness resided here, it hid itself well. When Montgomery dismounted, a man in fine clothes met him at the steps. Not a servant, not in the usual sense. The man carried himself too upright, his tone too measured. "Miss Elizabeth will receive you shortly," he said. No deference, no fear. Just composure. Inside, Elizabeth Preston awaited him in the parlor. She looked different. Thinner, perhaps, but steady. There was an unmistakable dignity in her bearing, something that unsettled the sheriff. He explained his visit, politely, formally. Concern had been raised, he said, about her sister's health, about the nature of certain domestic arrangements. Elizabeth smiled faintly. "I see," she said. "And do these arrangements break any law of Georgia?" Montgomery hesitated. "None that I can enforce," he admitted. "Then our business is concluded," she replied. But he pressed further. "Miss Elizabeth, are you aware that your conduct has caused considerable alarm in Savannah?" Her answer came like a blade. "Sheriff, Savannah is easily alarmed. It calls anything it doesn't understand a sin. Or a sickness." She offered tea. He declined. When he asked to see her sister, Elizabeth's tone softened, almost tender. "Margaret is indisposed," she said. "As for James and William, they assist in managing the property. Trusted men, nothing more." Her calmness unnerved him. Everything about the estate appeared in order, books balanced, workers accounted for, no hint of chaos. If madness existed here, it wore a mask of logic and grace. He left that afternoon with no grounds for action, but an uneasy feeling he couldn't shake. His report would later read, "Plantation in good condition. No signs of distress. Subject Elizabeth Preston rational, if somewhat peculiar in conviction." Behind his formal language lay a truth he didn't dare write. He didn't believe she was mad. He believed she was dangerous, not for what she'd done, but for how calmly she'd done it. That night, as Montgomery returned to Savannah, the fog thickened over the lowlands. The image of Elizabeth standing on the porch stayed with him, composed, resolute, unafraid. He couldn't have known it, but that visit marked the beginning of the end. Because not long after, word of his report reached the Preston cousins in Augusta and Atlanta, men who decided that if the law wouldn't intervene, the family would. And when they arrived at Willow Creek, they would not come alone. For 3 long months after the sheriff's visit, Willow Creek drifted into silence. The sisters stopped appearing in town altogether. No carriages came or went. Even the usual deliveries were signed for by messengers, never seen directly by the merchants who brought them. Still, the plantation ran like clockwork, cotton shipped, accounts settled, letters posted. From the outside, it looked normal. Too normal. But within the house, something deeper was stirring. In the ledgers and correspondences later uncovered, small anomalies appeared, shifts so subtle they almost went unnoticed. Orders for fine men's clothing continued. The household requested imported soap, tobacco, and silk waistcoats. And most curiously of all, a Savannah jeweler was commissioned to craft 2 matching gold rings, in men's sizes, paid for under the Preston family name. Merchants began to whisper. Neighbors began to wonder. And within the pine forests surrounding Willow Creek, rumors swelled like the humidity in the air. Thick, inescapable, electric. Inside those walls, the four who had defied society built a life suspended between secrecy and defiance. James and William, now dressed as gentlemen, took on the duties of estate managers. They met with suppliers, balanced accounts, and oversaw the fields with authority that blurred every accepted boundary. The enslaved workers, seeing this, began to sense something almost unimaginable, that the old order of things, at least within these gates, was shifting. But whispers have gravity, and gravity always pulls down. In early spring of 1847, the first letters of concern reached Savannah lawyers. Elizabeth Preston had sent word to Robert Fleming, the family's attorney, requesting that he revise the Preston will, dividing the estate equally between herself, her sister, and their husbands. She signed it plainly, Elizabeth Preston James. Fleming, horrified, refused. His return letter was restrained but firm. Such revisions would be neither lawful nor socially admissible. Elizabeth's reply came swiftly, her pen sharp as her resolve. What law is this that denies a woman the right to name her equal as heir? We break no natural order, only your invented one. From that moment, the Preston sisters crossed an invisible line. What had been dismissed as eccentricity now became heresy, a direct threat to the foundations of Southern society. Private letters between neighboring landowners reveal a growing unease. Words like corruption, moral infection, and dangerous influence appeared again and again. The family name, once whispered with admiration, now evoked disgust. And yet, within Willow Creek, life carried on. In those final quiet months, servants recalled faint music drifting through the night air, the sound of a piano, laughter, soft voices carried by the wind. Whether that memory was real or romanticized, no one could say. But even history, in its cold precision, can't resist imagining that brief flicker of happiness before the fall. Still, danger was closing in. The Preston cousins, men of power and pride, had decided the time for discretion had passed. They gathered allies, a physician, a legal counselor, and one specialist from the Georgia State Asylum. Their mission, to restore propriety and seize control of the estate. They would arrive unannounced, armed not with weapons, but with authority. But before they came, Elizabeth wrote one final letter, one no one read until a century later. If the world will not allow truth, let it burn. But know this, we lived it first. Beneath the tall pines that framed the house, the air hung still, waiting. Because soon, the gates of Willow Creek would open not for visitors, but for judgment. It was a gray morning in April 1847 when the Preston cousins arrived at Willow Creek. 3 carriages, a doctor, and one specialist from the Georgia State Asylum, sent to evaluate the sisters' condition. They came dressed in solemn black, carrying the authority of men who believed themselves the custodians of sanity, morality, and the family name. Behind their formality, however, was fear. Fear of what the Preston twins represented, and what their defiance exposed about the society they all upheld. Dr. Samuel Wilson was among them. He had been summoned once again, reluctantly. In his journal, he wrote, "I dreaded what I might find, and I dreaded even more what I might be asked to do." When the party reached the main house, they found it immaculate. Servants stood quietly. The air smelled faintly of lilacs. But there was something unsettling about the stillness, as if the entire estate was holding its breath. Then the doors opened. Elizabeth Preston stood in the doorway, her posture regal, her face unreadable. "You needn't knock," she said calmly. "You were expected." Inside, the parlor gleamed. The sisters had prepared for their arrival as though for a formal reception. Margaret sat by the window in a pale blue gown, her hair arranged with meticulous care. Beside her stood James and William, the men who had appended Georgia's social order. Dressed as gentlemen, they met the visitors' eyes without fear or apology. It was a tableau that should never have existed. 2 white women seated in elegance, 2 black men standing as their equals. Dr. Edward Hayes, the asylum specialist, would later describe the scene in his report. The arrangement of the bedrooms, the sharing of quarters, the demeanor of the so-called husbands, all pointed to an abandonment of social distinction. The women displayed not hysteria, but a calculated conviction that chilled the blood. When the family demanded that the sisters submit to examination, Elizabeth refused. "You have no authority here," she declared. "We are of sound mind. You are of weak courage." Margaret's voice trembled, but she echoed her sister. "We will not be taken." The confrontation grew tense. The men they loved, James and William, stepped forward protectively. Their presence, their poise, enraged the visiting cousins, who saw not human beings, but insolence. In the chaos that followed, voices rose, furniture overturned, and the fragile peace of Willow Creek shattered like glass. When the cousins ordered the men restrained, Elizabeth's composure finally broke. Dr. Hayes described her reaction as a cry not of madness, but of loss so profound it defied description. The sisters were forcibly removed from the estate that same afternoon. Bound in carriages, they were taken first to Savannah, and later to the Georgia State Asylum in Milledgeville, labeled as suffering from moral insanity and erotomania, the preferred diagnoses for women who defied convention. James and William's fate was swift and brutal. Plantation records later noted their removal and credit for transfer, suggesting they had been sold south, likely to New Orleans or Cuba. In the ledgers, their names vanished. By nightfall, the great house stood silent once more. The candles burned out one by one. Dr. Wilson's final note in his journal reads, "It is said that madness can spread like contagion. If that is true, then perhaps what infected these women was not delusion but courage, and perhaps that is the most dangerous sickness of all." Outside, under the endless canopy of Georgia pines, Willow Creek seemed to exhale, the last breath of a world that could not bear to witness what had lived within it. The rebellion was over. But its echo had only begun. The Preston sisters arrived at the Georgia State Asylum under heavy rain. The carriages rolled through the gates at dusk, their wheels sinking into red clay, the smell of wet pine filling the air. Behind the barred windows of the great stone building, other voices murmured, the forgotten, the condemned, the hysterical. In 1847, the asylum was not a place for healing. It was where society sent those it could not explain. Elizabeth and Margaret were admitted under diagnoses that sounded almost poetic in their cruelty: moral insanity and erotomania. Terms that, in truth, meant only this: women who refused to obey. The doctors recorded everything: their posture, their tone, even the way they looked at each other. But what those notes missed was the quiet dignity with which the sisters endured the unendurable. At first, they were kept together in a small cell, cold stone walls, one window, a shared cot. The attendants reported them as calm but unrepentant. They refused prayer sessions. They rejected confession. Elizabeth, in particular, unnerved the staff. One orderly described her eyes as sharp with reason, yet hopelessly lost to delusion. When questioned about their crimes, Elizabeth simply said, "We loved." You fear love because it levels you. Their days were ruled by routine, cold water treatments, sedatives, endless silence. They were expected to forget. But memory clung to them like a ghost. Each morning, Elizabeth asked the same question: "Has there been any word of James and William?" Each evening, she received the same answer: "None." After a month, the doctors decided to separate them, believing their condition fed off one another's presence. Elizabeth was moved to another ward. From that day on, both began to unravel, not from madness, but from absence. Yet, even apart, they found ways to reach each other. Nurses later confessed that they exchanged folded scraps of paper, written in a strange code, a mix of shorthand and symbols no one could decipher. Sometimes, attendants would find pressed flowers hidden beneath their mattresses, passed secretly between rooms. It was their rebellion in miniature, love surviving in fragments. Dr. Jonathan Miller, one of the attending physicians, left the most detailed records. In his notes from 1850, he wrote, "Patient EP maintains delusion of marriage to a Negro man. Displays intelligence in all other matters. No remorse. No confusion. A case of moral perversion beyond redemption." He could not understand that what he saw as delusion was, in truth, conviction. Margaret's health began to fail first. The records list wasting disease, but in truth it was likely tuberculosis, worsened by cold, starvation, and heartbreak. As her strength faded, she asked repeatedly to see her sister. The request was denied. When she died in January of 1850, The attendant said Elizabeth didn't cry. She simply went silent. 4 days, she refused food. When Dr. Miller urged her to repent, she replied softly, "I have nothing to repent. I loved truly." Few can say as much. In her final weeks, she was pale, skeletal, but calm. She spoke of a house surrounded by pines, of laughter carried by wind, of a life that had once felt free. On the evening of October 7, 1850, Elizabeth Preston refused her final meal. Her last words, recorded by Dr. Miller, were a whisper. "Margaret awaits me, and perhaps James and William too, somewhere the laws of men cannot reach." She died that night at peace. And with her, the last light of Willow Creek went out. For nearly a century after the Preston sisters' deaths, Willow Creek fell silent. The plantation passed into other hands, then fell to ruin. The fields that had once yielded cotton and profit grew wild with pine and kudzu. By the turn of the 20th century, even the name Preston had faded from conversation, a scandal too shameful for polite memory and too dangerous to preserve. But history, like love, has a way of surviving burial. In 1963, a young historian named Eleanor Hammond stumbled upon the asylum records while researching women's mental health in the antebellum South. What she found shocked her. The files listed Elizabeth and Margaret Preston, sisters, white, of prominent family, confined for moral insanity related to delusional marriage. She requested access to the notes. Among them, she discovered Dr. Miller's final entries, clinical, cold, but threaded with an unease he couldn't quite disguise. She turned those fragments into a paper that would later shake academic circles, Moral Insanity, the Case of the Preston Twins. In it, Hammond argued that the sisters' confinement wasn't proof of illness, but of a society's terror of female agency and interracial love. It was a bold claim for 1963, and it made her a target. But it also resurrected the Prestons, if only in whispers once again. 4 years later, something extraordinary happened. During renovations at an old law office in Savannah, workers uncovered a hidden compartment behind a crumbling wall. Inside were the long-forgotten papers of Robert Fleming, the same attorney who'd refused to change the sisters' will. Among the documents was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. On the front, in delicate handwriting, were the words, "For those who may one day understand." The letter inside was unmistakably Elizabeth's. "Our crime," she wrote, "was not impropriety but recognition. We saw humanity where others saw property. We chose honesty over hypocrisy. And for that, they called us insane." She described how her father had educated James and William in secret, recognizing in them minds equal to our own. After his death, she and Margaret had continued that forbidden legacy, running the plantation as partners with the men they loved. "That the world cannot understand such affection," she wrote, "reveals not our madness, but its own." The authenticity of the letter was debated for decades. Some historians dismissed it as a clever forgery, a romantic embellishment. Others, comparing its penmanship with authenticated correspondence, swore it was genuine. But the letter wasn't alone. In 1969, a researcher excavating the Willow Creek site discovered the stone foundation of a small outbuilding, elegant, private, unlike any slave quarters recorded in plantation ledgers. Beneath the floorboards lay fragments of porcelain, fine writing instruments, and, most tellingly, a small compartment containing books on philosophy, mathematics, and political theory. Dr. Richard Thompson, who led the dig, called it a gentleman's study, a space of dignity deliberately hidden within a world built on inequality. And perhaps most hauntingly, among the archives of the Georgia Historical Society, a single daguerreotype survived. It shows 2 plainly dressed women seated before the camera, and 2 strikingly handsome men standing just behind them, all 4 gazing directly into the lens. No names. No date. Only a notation, unidentified Savannah residence, circa 1845. Look closely, and you see something remarkable. Not fear. Not shame. But calm contentment. 4 people, briefly, impossibly, captured as equals. Even in silence, their faces speak louder than any sermon or law. And in that frozen image, you can almost hear them still, the echoes of Willow Creek, refusing to disappear. Today, nothing remains of Willow Creek Plantation. The house burned down in 1912, leaving only stone foundations swallowed by Georgia pines. If you walk there now, You'd never know that once, within that silence, for people built a world the South could not allow to exist. A world of equality, of defiance, of love. In 1969, more than a century after the scandal, a small group of students from the University of Georgia gathered at the site. They came not as historians, but as witnesses. Among them were descendants of the enslaved, descendants of the landowners, and those who claimed both lineages in one body. They placed a simple unmarked stone where the separate quarters once stood, a gesture, quiet and unceremonial, but profound. No speeches, no plaques, just silence. And in that silence, perhaps, the Preston sisters finally found company. One elderly woman, said to be descended from the neighboring Johnson plantation, was heard to murmur, "They knew what they were doing. All four of them. They wanted to show what was possible, even knowing it wasn't time yet." It's a haunting thought, that some people are born into centuries not yet ready for them. Elizabeth and Margaret Preston weren't saints. They were flawed, proud, and perhaps reckless. But they dared something extraordinary, to live with honesty in a world that rewarded deceit. To love across the most brutal divide their society had built. Their defiance exposed a truth the South could not bear to face, that the lines separating master and slave, white and black, woman and man, were not ordained by nature, but by fear. For that revelation, they were called mad. And yet, reading Elizabeth's final words, you sense no madness at all, only clarity. Southern society will destroy what it cannot understand, and it understands precious little beyond its own hypocrisies. History may have buried them, but their story survived, in fragments, in photographs, in the uneasy conscience of a nation still learning what freedom means. When you look at that daguerreotype, the only image left, you see not scandal or sin, but something achingly simple, for faces at peace. For souls, briefly equal, staring into the camera as if daring the future to recognize them. And maybe, after all these years, we finally do. Because their story isn't just about forbidden love or defiance. It's about the price of truth. About how far someone will go to live by their own moral compass when the world insists it's wrong. The Preston Twins remind us that change doesn't always come from revolutions or speeches. Sometimes, it begins quietly, in private moments of courage that history only later learns to name. Their world was not ready for them. But perhaps ours can be. When the wind moves through the pines of Savannah, locals say you can sometimes hear faint laughter. 2 women and 2 men, still walking the grounds where they once lived as equals. It's probably only wind. Or maybe, it's the echo of a promise never kept. That one day, love would not need to hide. And maybe that's what makes their story linger, not its tragedy, but its defiant hope. Because even in a century that caged them, they managed to prove something eternal. That love, real, fearless, and honest, will always find a way to exist, even in a world not ready to understand it.